So, session 3, competing with the best. Clearly we need to do this both at home and increasingly importantly abroad with the main grain exporting countries. So bearing this in mind, I'm particularly pleased that we managed to secure our first speaker today. An extremely impressive education, international education in both agricultural engineering and economics. He's been working for the Thunen Institute of Farm Economics since 2014, specialising in international benchmarking of cash crops. He's part of the Agri Benchmark project, which, as most of you hopefully now know, so is AHDB. He was a very impressive speaker at the Grain Market Outlook Conference a couple of years ago, which is where, right, I'm having Samuel for the Modern Farm Conference. So he's going to join us today and give us some observations in measuring international competitiveness. Samuel, over to you.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to come here to talk to you. It's quite challenging for me to discuss with farmers today because usually talking to traders is quite easy. They buy everything I say, but now I have to be a bit more precise on my statements. As was mentioned before, I'm from Brazil. That's not really a German name. I moved to Germany in 2011 and I've been there since. And today I want to talk to you about wheat, corn, soybeans, and rapeseed. So I know that there's not a lot of soybeans going on here, but I think it's quite important even for rapeseed growers to know what's going on in soybeans and also for corn. Just to explain a bit about my background here, I work for, I don't think this thing is working, I don't know. I don't know, but just the pointer, who should be here?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. So I work for this institute, it's called Thunen Institute. So what we do is to provide expertise or to provide policy advice to the Ministry of Agriculture in Germany. So my main task is when there is anything related to what will happen to the land prices after direct payments are not there anymore. So that's why we use this type of analysis. And within this Thunen Institute, we have a project called Agri Benchmark, as was mentioned before. And this project has the idea of having a comparable and standard cost of production analysis across several countries. And today I will talk to you about those topics. So I will go for a bit of a background explaining how our data come together and how can you interpret this data. And then I will go a bit on wheat. And I've selected, I will do a cross-country comparison and also talk a bit about Russia and Ukraine. I think that's quite important for everybody nowadays. And then I will move to corn. And on corn, I will have a special focus on Brazil. And then I will talk a bit about canola and soybeans. So every time I always use this slide because when you're talking about competitiveness, you can also talk about transportation, you can also talk about financing. So for me here, it means having the lowest cost of production per unit of output. So I'm looking at being competitive as being the cheapest producer or being able to put a commodity in the market with the lowest cost possible. So I'm just looking here within the farm, not looking at its whole supply chain as one could do as well. As you can see here, the Agri Benchmark Network, we are now in 39 countries and we collect data every year for those typical farms. I will explain a bit what those are. And the idea here is then in 2008, people got together and realized that's very hard to do benchmarking. I think the monitor farms know that it's very hard to compare farms because they have such a different production system. And then to make a meaningful comparison, you have to have some standards on how to collect the data and how to use and analyze this data. And here we see we are covering most of the most important countries. Those are the ones marked in green. But we don't do like the farm bench. So our data is not individual farm data. So what we do, we go, for instance, in the UK, we have farms in Cambridge, in Suffolk, and Norfolk. So what we do, we go there, we sit 10 farmers together, and we do what we call typical farm. So what is the most common type of farming, most common type of machinery, most common type of fertilization. So those are not individual farm data, and they try to represent the most common type of farm in the region. So those are not probably your farms, because a friend of mine always tells me if people come to a conference, they might be leading edge already, because if they are interested to know what other people are doing. So those are not an average, and they are not the top performance. So those are the most common type of farming. And just throughout the presentation, you'll see that on the right side there, we always use this notation for the farms. So the first two letters are representing the country, and the numbers represent the whole acreage of the farm, and the region is represented by these two letters on the end. And you see here in Germany, you see that we have the green areas where we have a lot of wheat. So our farms, they should be located in the hot spots of each country to represent the largest share of the output coming from those countries. So let's start. I'm talking about Russia and Ukraine because I think you guys have followed this development here, no? So if you look at that, that is the top exporters for wheat, and you see here that Russia, maybe 25 years ago, they were net importers of wheat, and now they are the top exporters. No? So last year they exported something around 32 million tons of wheat, surpassing US and the European Union as a whole. So you see here that the three main exporters are Russia, the EU as a big country, I will call it, and the United States. And then you have those other countries. What's also quite interesting is to look at Ukraine. You also see a very strong increase in exports, very strong increase in production as well. And Argentina. Argentina we will talk a bit about afterwards, but they also have started picking up some of the production that they left in 2012. Just to illustrate what I mean by typical farms, so that is a map from Ukraine and Russia. So in Ukraine we have farms, or our typical farms, they represent farms in those regions. No? So we don't represent the whole country. We don't even try to do so. The idea is really to represent the main regions. And you see here in Ukraine we have farms in all the three big regions, and in Russia our farms are on the black. Not our farms, those farms are not my farms. The typical farms, would be nice if they would be. Those typical farms, they are on the black soil, so they are in Krasnodar, Kurskis, and on the black soil there. Okay, so wheat. So the idea here is to have a cross comparison. So here if you look, you have the countries and you have the farms. And here I'm comparing wheat yields. So here it's tons per hectare. And you can see quite easily that there are two types of farming, I would call it. There is kind of a low yielding countries and high yielding countries. You see here Australia, Canada, Argentina, somewhere between 3-4 tons per hectare, whereas we have then the European countries, Germany, France, UK, going somewhere between 9, 10, or 11 tons per hectare. And then here we have Russia and Ukraine. I don't know how many of you have been to Russia. You have people producing 1.5 tons and people producing 6 tons. So it's quite hard to say what is the average. So here, what we have, the farmers, they are not the average. They are somewhere above this average. They are somewhere between 4.5, 5 tons per hectare of wheat. In Ukraine, you also see a big difference. And also there is a big difference between the type of management. So if you go to Russia, you'll see that there are agro holdings, and there are also private farms, and there are also Western farms, and they have a very different type of management, a very different type of results as well. And why is that so? If you just look at one of the indicators, there will be nitrogen input per hectare. You see that there is a big difference between what the guys in Australia put in their land, and if you compare it to the European countries, 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, that's not even the highest what you can see. So you see here that there is a big difference, and that's why throughout the presentation I will be discussing costs per ton, because you might think, okay, we are somewhere here, but we spend also 3 times more than the other guys. No? So on the world market, we don't trade hectares, we trade tons. So that's why we'll be looking at tons. If you look at the key costs, so those are costs. If you look at the green bar, those are direct costs. So those are fertilizer, seeds, so those are the green costs here. And that is in dollars, US dollars per hectare. The dark blue one, those are operating costs, hired labor, family labor, machinery, and diesel. And if you look at this one, this is land costs. So land costs is either land rents or opportunity costs of renting out your own land. So you see here, if you look at a per hectare basis, yeah, the European countries have a very high costs, but as you saw before, also very high yields. So it doesn't really make too much sense to compare on a per hectare basis. What you can also see here, that's something very interesting that we have to discuss a bit. Land prices are very high in the European countries, and that is also because you can also get much more output of your land, and also maybe because of direct payments. If you look at Russia and Ukraine, very low land costs, and that has a very long history. Why is that so? But it's very interesting to see as well. So that, for me, is the one that we can also spend some time on. So those are the same costs, but now divided by the yields. No? So those are costs per ton. If I want to put, if the Matif price, I don't know how much is now, but if that will be the cost that you can also put your product in the market. No? So what you see here is that countries are not so different as people usually would think. Even Australia, Canada, and Argentina, they have much lower production, but also much lower inputs, much lower costs. So they are quite competitive when it comes to the world market. What you see here for the UK farms, so those are farm gate prices. As you can see here, at least from our data, it has been very tight for the UK farms. So to pay for the full cost, to pay for opportunity cost of capital, opportunity cost of own land. If you look at direct costs, everybody can pay for direct costs, no? Because the difference between those two are very high. But when you put everything on your machinery, on your land, on your own capital, then is when the picture gets a bit different. No? Something also very interesting to look is the difference in prices. So I was talking to Richard before that we had, if you look at the European farms, they have quite similar prices. That makes sense, very similar infrastructure. But if you look at the Russian farms, they have a very strong penalty for prices, and that comes mainly for the cost of transporting these goods somewhere because they are consumed outside of Russia. If you look at Argentina, it's quite alarming how cheap prices are here, and that's mainly because here we still have the export taxes. So there used to be an export tax of 18 or 20%, so that's why prices are so low. Those export taxes no longer exist, so for the next years we should see prices coming up to similar levels here as well. When we look at cash costs, so the idea here is then to look at more short term. So short term, I don't have to pay for my own labor, I don't have to pay for my own capital. So what is the cheapest or the lowest cost I can afford to bear to be able to support or to supply to the market? So those are only cash expenditures. So everything I have to pay, my hired labor, my diesel, my direct costs. And you see here that the Russian and Ukraine farms, they can deliver wheat to the market for less than $80 per ton. And that is why you see a lot of pressure, not the only reason, but why you see a lot of pressure coming from those Eastern countries, because they can actually deliver wheat in a very low prices. If you see here on the European farms, we have a big difference also between those farms, and you see that we are somewhere between $180, $175 per ton. That will be, so to say, paying all the expenditures that you have in your farms. What I also want to show is that what has happened along the time. So what I did now, I just took 4 farms from different countries, so Germany, France, UK, and Russia. And I have a time series from 2012 onwards. So what you can see, I think everybody knows that margins used to be very nice, and then they started squeezing a lot because prices have come down quite significantly. And I think just to explain, so those are farm gate prices, and those are the revenues accounting for the couple payment. Because the couple payment is the coupled, but there's still a payment. So if you allocate this payment to the ton, you see here that there is a benefit for farmers when they have the direct payment. So what I want to show is that it has come down for everybody, the margin, so it's not only a European thing. And, but what you can see is that a lot of countries are still able to do kind of profit, economic profit, because they pay for the total costs. But if you look, this is a farm in Suffolk, so that is one of the regions. And you see here that if you look only at the red dots, probably the farm is not paying for the total cost. You know? So what is making the farm profitable and the economic sense is then the direct payments. It doesn't mean that you need direct payments, because direct payment, they also have an influence on land costs. So the expectation is that if you don't have direct payments, your land costs should go down. So these bars should go down, and then probably you should be fine with the farm prices. I don't know that, we're gonna see it, but for the structure we have now, direct payments are still very important to keep the most common type of farms in the business. Whether or not they should be in the business is a different question, but it has been very important for people, these direct payments. And you see here, just to explain the graph a bit, so cash cost, depreciation, and opportunity costs. Looking about Russian wheat, I just want to give you some insights on the trade of Russia and how they produce. So here you see those are the main export destinations from Russian wheat. You see here they are very strong in the Middle East and Egypt, so very strong. There's a very strong regional preferences for Russian wheat, and our colleagues from Russia, they call it a Russia meridian, because most of the wheat coming out of Russia will be exported in this line there, as you can see. You know? So there is a preference for quality. So those, the wheat coming out of Russia usually goes in these directions there, mainly to north of Africa and also to some places in the Middle East. Something else that happened in Russia is that we see a very strong differences on the way it used to be looking at quality of wheat. So so looking at total export. So you see here, if you follow the arrows, you see that Russia used to export a lot of high quality wheat, so more than 13% of protein. And now they've moved to more medium class or medium range protein levels on wheat. So you see here that the bulk of exports is somewhere between 11.5% and 13% of protein. So there's a very important shift. It also has happened in two directions. You have lower output of very high protein content wheat, and you have then this big bulk of proteins between 11.5 and 13. So that was on wheat. Let's look a bit on corn. Corn is very important for me, and I also think for a lot of people in the room as well. I just want to show again what are the main exporters on corn. As you can see, corn is much more concentrated in the market. You have then 4 big players making up a large share of the output. You know? So you see here, the big export is still the US. By far, they are the biggest exporter. And then you have Brazil as the second one most of the years. And then you have Argentina. And then Ukraine is also very important. Doing like Donald Trump. And you see here that Russia is still not really very strong in wheat and corn, sorry. And you see here in Brazil, we have this very strange picture. I will explain a bit why we do that and why we have these big gaps in production. And that's also quite interesting. When you look at corn yields, again, tons per hectare, what you can see here, there is also big difference in types of farming. So if you look at the North American farms, US and Canada, they will be somewhere between 11.5, 12 tons per hectare. Whereas we in Brazil, we might be somewhere between 6, 6.5. and Argentina somewhere in the middle between 7 and 8. If you look at Russia and Ukraine, they're still somewhere close to Argentina, somewhere between Brazil and Argentina. But still, there are two different types of production system. If you look at the North American countries, they have a much higher investment on inputs, nitrogen, and then you see also difference in yields. Just look in the total cost per ton of output again, so dollars per ton. What you can see is that Argentina is one of the cost leaders. They're very, very cheap production, very cost efficient. You see Brazil here having a hard time to pay for all the costs, and that's also expected in Brazil. I will explain why. In US, you have a big problem with what's called land costs. So you have a very nice price. If you look at the price in the US, it's one of the highest you can have because very nice, very good supply chain, very good transportation system. So prices at farm gate are very good, but also very high land prices. So you have then this, because prices are not really the main decision making, because prices are just one factor. So you need to have good costs to have any margin you might want. What you can also see for corn, again, you see Russia and Ukraine, they are much more on the same level of prices as the US than comparing to Brazil and Argentina. And that's something quite interesting to keep in mind because people are always talking about wheat in Russia because they are very strong in wheat. But what we see is that they are doing a very good margin on soybean and corn as well. So they could also be changing some of the patterns from those two crops as well. Why is that so bad in Brazil? So people might ask, why we do corn then? Because in Brazil and Argentina, we have a bit of a different system. So we do what we call double cropping. And I will just spend 5 minutes on double cropping. So the idea is that you have 2 seasons in 1 year. So that's not crop rotation because in every summer we have soybeans. So we have summer soybeans and winter corn. So it's 2 crops in the same year. If you look at the Brazilian farm, we will have always on the main regions we had always 100% of soybean in summer, and then for the second season we might go to 60–70% will be on corn. And why we do that? It's just because in Brazil we are somewhere between 98% of no-till, so we need some crops to go over the winter time. And it used to be wheat, but now corn is a bit better for us. And so the big difference is then when comparing Brazil to the US, in the US, farmers have to choose between soybean and corn. In Brazil, we don't choose it, we do both. So that's the big difference why we have these lower prices and lower yields, because it's the second crop for us. If we would grow corn as a first season, we would have exactly the same yields as in the US. So it's not natural deficiency, it's just because the system is like this. And I just wanted to highlight how it works. So here we start in October, we start seeding with no-till, we start seeding soybeans. And as you see here, we are in a tropical country, a lot of fungicides, herbicides, and insecticides. So crop protection is very strong in Brazil. That's why BASF and Bayer, they love Brazil because they sell a lot of products there. And then we will then have usually 100 days or 105 days soybeans. And then in February or beginning of March, we will then harvest soybeans. And right after soybeans, in February again, we start planting corn. So that is the way it works. And then you have not so intensive corn. And then you have until August, you have then corn. So you have in our summer, you have the soybeans, and then you have some corn afterwards. And after August, we have usually livestock. So we have 2 crops and beef. So the idea is that before we harvest corn, what we do is to spray. We came with the airplane and spread some grass seeds, and it grows underneath the corn. Then you can harvest the corn and put cattle on it. So that is the idea. And then you see the process here coming. You have then livestock on the system until October. October we come with glyphosate and do again no-till in soybeans. So that is the system. That's why I like to show this picture, because this picture is everywhere about Brazil. And people, when they look at this picture, they see, oh, these big commercial farms destroying the forest. And I always show this picture because it shows what we do. No? So what you see there, in the front line you have people or farmers harvesting soybeans, and the back line planting corn. So it's operation that is done usually in the same day. So you have people harvesting and planting on the same day or the same week. So that's why I like to show this picture. Nobody does this way because it's really cost inefficient to have so many there. But that is the idea, no? So the idea is to have then this type of production. I just want to show some of the climate data. So if you look here, those bars are precipitation. In Brazil, we usually don't complain too much about water. We have somewhere between 2,000 millimeters a year. So it's quite enough for us. And then we have here, as I say, here we start with soybeans and then corn, and that will be our dry period then in the season. And just to show that, so those are the regions where we produce grain in Brazil, corn and soybeans. And what you can see here is that it's very much on this state here, Mato Grosso. This is the Amazon forest, so it's quite far from the forest. And then here you have then the most of the production. And on this chart on the right side, the orange bar, it shows the total production for this, what we call second season corn, so coming after soybeans. And the blue bar shows the first season corn, so it will be corn on summer. And you see that this type of corn is much more volatile because you have, like in 2016, when I presented to AHDB, I was saying, look, we had a very bad year because there was a drought in February, so you might lose 25 million tons in the country because the production goes down very quickly. And now I'm coming here and show you this big bar here. So we had in Brazil the highest season we have ever had in corn, and that also is not so positive as people might think because we end up having something like this. So I don't know if you can see the picture, but there was no storage available. So people were just piling corn everywhere you can see. So this is a big Caterpillar tractor. So you see that's the way they had to store it because there's just too much corn. So corn is for us a second crop, and it comes in a very good way for farmers to have more cash inflow, to use better their machinery, and to be able to do a bit of risk management there as well. Looking at the canola and soybeans, so rapeseed, we have also a similar picture as we have for wheat. So looking at yields, you see here Australia and Canada, somewhere between 2.5 tons per hectare. If you look at the European countries, we'll be somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5 tons. So this is Wash, Suffolk, and Cambridge. At least from our data, we have data since 2008, we always see some yield penalty between these German farms and the UK farms. I'm not so sure why is that so. I'm not saying that everybody has 3.5 only, but that's something that is quite remarkable for us because at least from my perception, that it should be very similar to German levels as well. And you can see here that Germany, those two regions are very strong in rapeseed production as well. When we look at inputs, quite clear, no? If you look at any input, you see the big difference there and the way people invest in their own land. And if you look at total costs, and then again this idea on cost per ton, what you can see is that rapeseed prices are much more stable. They have much lower variation compared to not variation within years, but the variation between the regions. And what you can also see that the cost of productions are also somehow per ton, they are more similar, I would say, across countries. One thing that might be nice to look at is Ukraine again, being very, very cheap or very cost effective on producing. And yeah, and I think that the important thing is that at least for our data, when you look at the UK, you have very, very nice, or at least you have an economic profit on rapeseed as well. The last crop, soybeans. So soybeans, I think there is also two types of production systems. You have here Brazil, Canada, and the US, where we are somewhere between 3.5, sometimes to 3.3 tons per hectare. And then we have the new soybean growing countries like Russia and Ukraine, and those guys are somewhere between 2. For us, we hope that that's going to be the picture for the future as well, because, I mean, if you look at the potential they have just for doubling yields, times don't know how many million hectares, you know how much soybean will be on the market. The biggest problem here is still what we call like a new crop problem. So they need some genetic material that adapted to their own conditions. And one of the big things that they have usually a very dry August, which makes soybeans, which gives soybeans a hard time to fill grains. No? Argentina, a big difference, but most of Argentina will be somewhere between similar to Brazil as well. And look at total costs. Again, what you see here is that Brazil, Canada, it's very competitive. Those countries are very competitive. Argentina is for sure the cost leader. They can produce soybeans really, really cheap. The problem has always been that they have a very, very low prices, so margins are not as good as they could be. But if the president keeps his promise and waives the export taxes, prices should be somewhere here. So Argentina will be very strong there on margins for soybean as well. What we see in Russia and Ukraine is that there is no penalty for prices because Russia and Ukraine are net importers of protein. So farmers, if you look at the margins that they can make in soybeans, it's quite remarkable the way that they can produce soybeans. So just some of the take-home messages. I think every time I speak about Russia and Ukraine, I get a bit, because they are cost leaders in most of the things that they produce. So they are cost leaders in wheat. They are also cost leaders in corn. Not cost leaders, but they are very cost competitive when it comes to corn and soybeans. As I said before, for us it's also a very interesting question why we see this yield penalty in the UK farms when it comes to rapeseed. And I think that's a very important, discussion that we might have, that at least for the most common type of farming, direct payments have been very important to keep kind of economic profit for those farms. As I said before, double cropping is also something that is very important for Brazil. And the big discussion for me is that because Russia and Ukraine, they are very strong in most of the crops, which crops will they be growing in the next 10 years? No? So if you look at margins, wheat has the lowest margin. No? So if you look at within the farm, they should be going more for soybeans and corn. So I think that will be a challenge not only for Europe, but for most of the countries. Sorry, I think I overstepped a bit. Yeah, thank you very much.